Hello, class, and welcome to week 6 here of PM 125 at Spirit and Life Seminary. Hope that you have had a blessed week. Hope that you have enjoyed your reading, your learning, and participating in discussion with one another. Certainly, most of you are tremendously engaged, and I believe that from your writing are learning and expanding. That's the goal of this course, as well as any particularly academic nature in the church or ministry elements, is that we learn practical ministry as well as theological foundations. And again, it seems that many of you are applying what you're learning to both your current situation and your past. Certainly, I want to encourage you, nothing that we have read or nothing that we've discussed is something to make us feel bad about past failures or maybe struggles that we've had to lay blame, but rather to reflect upon the past and our present so that our future is in a better position to succeed. And so be encouraged by that. This is you taking an effort to learn and to grow so that you can be better moving forward. We're continual life learners, and all of us learn every day and every week something we can better. So be encouraged by that. As we begin week 6, certainly we're in the final 3 weeks now of this stretch, and I want you to enjoy it, but certainly be prepared again for the final paper that is approaching many of our schedules with the assembly, mine included. So for those of you that are participating, try to keep your schedule ahead. I will be answering questions as quick as I can. And so a couple of those things I did want to address were questions that I have either answered already individually or something I wanted to answer in a group setting. One of the questions that I was received by email this past week was a practical one, and I thought it was very good to discuss as a group, or at least share with you that answer that I gave them. And that was a question regarding, from the policy manual, some of the reporting that is there, if there are any Word or Excel templates or other digital, we would say, templates for those reports. I will tell you that through the years I have had those. It has been many years since I've used a Word document to do a report. I used to use those, and I would save those on my computer for monthly, just as my own internal records. However, in North America, we have moved to an online reporting, and I've been doing that for a number of years now. And so my report template that I have is outdated to the current report that is available. And so what I would suggest is check with your state, your regional or national overseer, and ask them if there is a way to do that. A digital is great to have a record to fill in without bad penmanship, but online is perfect. So that would be just my comment to that. The other one was regarding some final paper questions, and to the one that sent this, I apologize for not answering the fullness of this by email, so I thought I would share these with you, because as you're reading your syllabus for your final paper, there are questions that emerge, and I did tell you to please reach out to me. And so let me answer their questions to all of us. The first question they asked was if you could recommend 1 or 2 scholarly sources that could help me in the requirement of the final paper. I will attempt to post some of these for everyone. However, a part of research is searching and finding resources. That is certainly a part of it. And so there is academic resources in theological circles that will be available to you. They are not overly difficult to find, but at the same time may not be in your initial Google search. So a couple places I would tell you to look is if you have some software such as Logos. That is generally somewhat expensive software, but there are several sources there that can be used. But again, I will attempt to share some with you. It is generally, from my experience, if you look for in the chapters that you're reading, here's a big cue for you. At the end of every chapter that we've came in contact with, there has been a list of other reading, or there has been a reference to where a quote was. So there are, I haven't counted them, but dozens, if not near 100 plus, that have been used. One particular chapter, I believe, may have been conflict. I had listed 5 or 6 additional books to read. So the best source I would give you would be that, because it extinguishes from there. But again, searching, this is, again, more than web articles. This is academic, scholarly sources, and that may not fully answer it, but start with your actual material, see that. Use some softwares. If you are enrolled in any other program, have access to a library that has theological material in it, certainly that could work for you, and that will be a part of it. Again, if I run across any of those, I will send to you. Sometimes the seminary will provide those, so we'll check with the offices to see if they can help us any better. But again, your book should answer that. Second question they ask is, what about web sources? Can I make any suggestion? This is, again, based off what you're writing and what you are focusing in. This is very specific to what you have, especially when you get into your unique situation. However, the aspects that they kind of part 3 ask there is, what about the development of the administrative structure chart, including persons and positions, decision making, and implementation levels? We are not going to provide a template for that, but this is maybe simpler than you might be taking it. This is the organizational chart. Again, if you do searches for organizational charts, you should see many examples. This is used in business as well as ministry, even if it's not physically performed on the ministry side in many places, but you have a structure of how your leadership functions. And so this is saying take that. So I would tell you to take a Google search, look at some organizational structures where you would see in a local church in simplicity, you have a senior pastor that serves directly under state, national, or regional overseer. And then what is next beyond that? What is your ministry structures in your church? For mine, that next line down would have a finance committee, a deacon, a what we call church ministry team, and a pastoral staff, and each of those have elements under those. And so what is that? Every one of ours will look a little bit different. The second part they quoted is, what about a sample church budget? Those are, again, available in your research. A part of this is research. Hopefully your church already has one, so you will be able to use that as your template and your basis, but it should be there, as well as some of these chapters do deal with finances, with reports, and those things. And so, again, that's not overly specific, but the point is to do some research so that you can gain that. If I gave you simply a template and you filled it in, then it misses out on the research, because there's a variety of ways to do, for example, an organizational structure. Different churches are structured differently. Budgets, there's different ways for churches to function in a budget, meaning how do you break out categories, what ministries get designated funds, what is maybe offering based, etc. So that's church specific. The allocation of those funds, again, are very specific, whether you use maybe what would be a traditional form of surplus tithes, whether it is offering, again. So a couple of those things are something that you need to answer to your specific church. Fourth, the question they continued with in this, and again, all these are great questions, I felt like, regards in the administration of this question 4, and I'm going to read the final paper, must explain the students' theology of Pentecost local church ministry. They must share about their calling and how it's contributed to their local ministry, and they must expound biblical support that informs the Pentecostal theology of ministry, and then the local church engaging and contributing towards the fulfillment of the mission and value. So they asked, should this respond to the administrative aspect? And so this is, where does the theological basis tie into the administration? Maybe another way to say that, but simply from a Pentecostal foundation, theologically, we want to see, how does your ministry contribute inside of the context of the structure that you're writing about, and how does that support the mission of the church and the biblical nature? As much as this is church administration, we're still in a spiritual biblical context, and so how does that relate? So I hope that brings some clarity to that, and again, ultimately, how does that fulfill the mission and vision of the church? And last, they ask, so in a vision and mission statement. They share their personal one, and it's a concise statement, both of which are, and simply they wanted to know if that was enough. Mission and vision statements should be concise. However, I would encourage you to expound on what that means. And again, I can only speak to my context. That vision statement very much ties to our ministry aspect and the activity that comes from it. It is not a standalone statement, but rather an empowering statement of three distinctive areas of focus of what we do. And so I would encourage you to expound on that and how that then relates to your organizational structure. And so the mission and vision statements and those aspects should not be disconnected from organizational structure. They support, they work together. We might call it hand in glove. So certainly that hopefully will answer some, maybe some questions some others have as well. And with that, we want to jump right into, again, week 6, which is managing conflict and accountability, chapters 15 and 16 this week, and 2 chapters, probably a little bit more, and maybe managing conflict chapter, but nonetheless very good. As we look into the big picture of this chapter, most of the time conflict is viewed in a very negative fashion. It is not seen as being good. It's not even seen as possibly could be good. However, as a leader, you have to know and understand how to handle conflict. It will happen in the church. What is your mindset dealing with conflict? It is possible to say, and very probable to some degree, conflict may happen more in a church than it would in a non-congregation or church setting, such as a business setting, simply because in a business or work setting, we usually are defined in a very narrowed focus of individual's life. We work together for one purpose. We have a job to perform, often with a clarity of job description, not always, but to some degree. In the church, it is our life. It is our church family. We're intermingling our personal life, our spiritual life, our physical life, our family life, all under one setting. And so it's a very diverse relational makeup. And so because of that, it is a breeding ground that could produce conflict. And so as leaders, we have to be prepared for it and not unexpectedly surprised by it. Often we can lose our thought process because we don't expect it. I'm not saying be negative, but nonetheless, relationships of different perspectives, dealing with different families and the backgrounds can definitely create an opportunity for conflict. So the question becomes, as you begin reading this, is what is your mindset in conflict? What is your mindset as you look towards conflict? Is conflict something to avoid? Is conflict something that you should see as something you should run away from? Is it something you approach on how do I address it and bring resolution? And so this first few pages, I should say is about really your mindset. And I want to encourage you to not see it always as negative, not to see it as something that is impossible. Could it be something that helps you address what you need to do to reach the vision? Is it an opportunity or a problem? Certainly, we don't want broken relationships. Certainly, we don't want to be focused on negative aspects. However, problems can present opportunities to move you one step closer to your vision, your purpose, individually and certainly in the congregation of the corporate body of Christ. And so I encourage you to look in this area and begin to ask yourself, what is your approach to conflict? And as an early pastor or early in ministry, certainly I felt like conflict was difficult. In fact, one of the things that many people young in ministry struggle with, no matter where they're at, is when they encounter their first conflict, they become discouraged because they think the church is perfect and being spiritual beings, loving Jesus and Christ-like, that there would never be any conflict, that we would always come together in love and happiness. But it is that first sad awakening that it's not so. But instead of being negative and discussing and being lost in the negative side of that, look at it as we are all together working for the purpose of Christ. And in that, we are learning and growing together. And it's an opportunity. And so I encourage you to look at things in that way so that so that your mindset is in a better position for this. As you look into it, it begins to talk to us about different perspectives of conflict. There are different leadership styles as we approach it. The authoritative one leader is to manage. While we would not want to call our structure authoritative or authoritarian, is we do come from some level of structure where the leader, the pastor, is solely responsible for the authority of both the spiritual house and the administrative house, the pastor and president, some would call it. And so, because of that, much of this responsibility does rest on the pastor. However, often we need to be ready to employ teams or boards, ministry partners that can come alongside of us, both in house and out of house, to approach conflict. Some churches are more what we would call congregational, in the sense that committees and boards are the leaders and the pastor serves under them. And so that approach may be a little different, but this is also a style of how you look at things. I mentioned some people approach the very concept of conflict as it is wrong. Even the writing of this says that some approach it in the context it's sinful and immediately assume it's detrimental to all. Inevitably, this mindset will cause turmoil because human nature, our imperfection, there will be some element of conflict. And so instead of having that mindset, we need to, again, be somewhat prepared for it. If we always think there will be conflict and we're always looking to create conflict or find the conflict around us, then we will be embraced and drown in conflict. So finding a correct mindset to conflict is that it will happen. It's a part of healthy relationships, even in the church. It's how we work together. Iron sharpening iron itself is not a natural feel-good, but rather it is the resistance of one versus the other, both equally committed to moving forward, that iron sharpening iron, both end up sharper in the end. And so even more in the church, we must look for the opportunity. I mentioned the holistic concept of the church family together, but think of it even further. A church family that is in commitment to their church is passionate about our beliefs, our theological. If you look, look into church history, not just in our movement, but Christian history, is that time after time we see churches break away from one another and cause division, hence more denominations, and so many get upset about that. And certainly we don't want to have a loss of a Christ-like character. But look at it this way: we are committed passionately to a set of beliefs, to a mission and a purpose that we not just intellectually but spiritually feel compelled to do. And so when we have resistance, when we see our values shaken, it can create tension and conflict. So we have to, again, as leaders, be prepared how to handle conflict. In the section under capacity building, this is a great section that I think we can look at. There's three areas that the writer speaks to us about how to build capacity to be prepared as leaders to handle managing conflict. And he says that the first element that we should be prepared or should be working towards is to build congregational capacity. This is where we teach about healthy relationships. This is where we, as we preach, as we teach, as we discuss, we talk about in relationships there is conflict. It is in brother and sister and church family working together that there will be conflict. But if we're loving and we're gracious and we're full of mercy in those relationships, that it will make us all better. And preparing our congregation for it to be a positive experience, for our own mindset to be that, will help prepare us to manage it when it does come. Conflict doesn't always have to be negative. It doesn't always have to be, but rather it speaks in here that if in our relationships that we understand forgiveness and righteousness and goodness to one another, that it will be an important part. It even says this: learning to disagree agreeably is fundamental for the healthy church. We will not always agree on everything, and that is okay. So that's an important aspect. The second, he says, is that it's important that we build institutional capacity. And so what he speaks of here is that we're inside of our local church or even the denomination having standard operating procedures for this. Certainly, we don't want to, as he says, create an extensive manual how to do it. But in the denomination, there are some limited aspects of it that we may have. But even inside the local church, we may want to address how do we handle some of these larger issues. What is a healthy approach to conflict management? Maybe we don't call it conflict management, but how do we handle disagreements in leadership? How do we handle that? And so thinking of this in advance. This is probably hard for us, and especially our smaller churches, because we don't want to think first and foremost about the negative. But again, if we see it as a positive, then we plan as a matter of discipling. How do we handle when we have disagreements? What does it look like? What is our process? Not to oversimplify this, Jesus gives us in part a model where brother sits down with brother, sister with sister, to discuss their disagreements, to try to bring some conclusion, and then bringing in someone else. So when that conflict arises, who do we bring in? How does that process? So essentially what we're saying to our church is that while we are not wanting to create argument, we are wanting to create a healthy environment where when we disagree, we can talk about it. We can work together with other brothers and sisters, spiritual leaders, to find resolution. And we breed a ground that it's healthy and not negative. I can't say I've done this by any means perfect or very formal, but it is, even if you're a pastor or a leader, it's things you say that may not be policy, but it's your response when someone begins to bring you disagreement, or when you as a leader hear someone come to you and speak of a negative conflict, or just any conflict at all. It's your response. One of my mentors often or later from our years mentioned to me that when someone came to them with a disagreement with how another leader in that church was handling things, that even as a senior pastor, he would not address their negative or their complaint or their disagreement, but rather he would say, have you went to that person? He forced them into a biblical model. It wasn't a written policy, but it was certainly his personal policy. And because of that, either one of two things happened. Either they approached it and dealt with it, or they just went about their way and forgot it, realizing it really wasn't that big of a deal, probably. And so, in other words, he did not create a breeding ground for people to create conflict and become the agent to receive that. The third area of building capacity is personally to you as a leader. A part of this chapter, that's what we're focusing on, is how do you prepare yourself to handle conflict through your personal time of study, certainly the Word, but resources, learning such as this chapter, again, is a great example. Finding ways for yourself to build capacity in yourself, your leadership skills. How do you lead people through conflict? And so this material, but even this chapter references some other resources. There's quotes from other books. Those are great places to start. But articles and things that you read, pay attention. How do you handle that? Don't just avoid, I don't want to have conflict. I'm believing God's going to bless us and never have conflict. That's proverbially putting our head in the sand. But rather, how do we proactively, positively handle conflict? Continue to develop yourself and have some idea of how you're going to handle it. That is something that is important to you. The key is intentionality. Be intentional as a part of what you do. If you focus on the mission and the vision of the church as the forefront, I believe that it can diminish areas of conflict, not remove them. But I have often said to the churches I have pastored that we will never agree on everything. But it is essential that we agree on the main things, and as a local body, we must be committed to the vision of this house. When we do what we call the growth journey, it is a course, a training, a 4-week discipleship program, and a huge piece of that is we tell them this is what we're here for. And in so doing, we tell them literally, if this is not what you're committed to, then this church may not be for you. Now that sounds like we're running people off, but what are we saying? The most important thing we do here is this mission, this vision. This is what we're here for. And if I can create unity around that, everything else becomes secondary. The methods, the ideology behind it, Those things become second, but if we can agree on the main thing, it creates unity. Then through unity, we can discuss conflict to achieve the thing we're unified about. And so keeping that at the forefront, not just written on the wall or some statement, but rather communicating that we're rallying around those concepts of vision and mission, what that is to your body. What does that look like played out in the ministry? This is what we're committed to, gives you something. I believe a church that lacks vision and clarity of vision is where people can get lost in the small things, and where problems arise not only, but rise greater than the church that has a clear vision that is communicated often. The key is to focus on the vision. Again, I'm not saying if you clearly do that, that no conflict happens. But again, I believe it gives a contrast of the primary and the secondary. And so if we get our focus off the vision, the church does, then we can often get selfish. One of the other elements that is spoken of here is also be intentional in relationship building. Certainly as pastors, as leaders, relationship we understand is imperative to the ministry aspect, but it is harder to have conflict with people you like. Notice that statement from the book. My mentor, again, referencing him, I found as much as I loved him, as much as I believe he loved me, that if we were not in a fairly often dynamic beyond the ministry to build relationship, to talk, how's your life going? What's going on in my life? And we built that relationship and continue to tie strings to keep our relationship close, that I would begin to second guess him and begin to question motives. And I certainly don't know his thoughts, but I learned if we built relationship, and he was intentional about it, and I attempted to be as well, that it kept our relationship closer, which minimized negative aspects and certainly minimized conflict, because I understood his heart and his passion. Even if I didn't always agree with him, I understood his heart. And so relationship is important there. And so those are some elements to continue to build intentionally behind that. So what happens when conflict emerges? There's a section titled Assessing Conflict. We must know the situation. We must have some skills to assess the conflict, to understand what is going on, how important is it, how big of an issue is it. Many problems in the church have happened because one extreme or the other has happened. We assess the situation, or maybe the lack of, and think it's no big deal, but yet it blows up and becomes a very big deal. Or we poorly assess the situation and we give it a ton of attention, but ultimately it was a small thing and our attention actually made it bigger. And so how we handle the conflict begins in how you assess the conflict. And so simply, we must know to some degree what the conflict is. We must have some basis of assessing that information. And so first we must know the facts and begin to gather information. This is not a investigation from a police concept, but it is to understand what is going on without taking sides, without making a conclusion, but evaluate the situation. The writer of this section begins talking about evaluating environmental issues, cultural issues, historic issues, what's going on not just in the micro, in the magnified element of this conflict, but what are the historical. If you will look into most situations, the conflict, particularly relationally, if you look at it, there may be a moment that something occurred, but historically, oftentimes there have been a series of things that have occurred and maybe have never been dealt with, but now you're at a point of great conflict that is really a historical small conflict over and over and over that now has blown up, so to speak. And so understanding the historical of that, the environment around it, what other things played into this, what culturally is going on in the community and the situation. Again, every conflict is different. Simply what's going on in and around this situation is important, from the church to the community to the tradition. So here's a reality as well that the writer speaks of. Rarely ever is a conflict simple. Usually there are several contributing factors, and often if you sadly ever get into, if I dare call it, a debate or an argument, and maybe playing the middle person, the moderator or person trying to mitigate that situation, one or two of those parties may focus on a simple The one thing, but really when you look at it, occurs even in pastoral counseling, is that there are a variety of contributing factors. You may be called in as pastor or leader to a conflict, to a problem, and this can be in a marriage or it can be in church ministry. And often they will present this simple approach, but a good counselor, for example, helps begin to build in layers of what really contributed to that being an issue. Same thing in conflict management. What are the contributing factors? What are the circumstances around this? Help me understand what led up to this. What was the motive? So we must simply think about the whole situation, the whole relation, the whole ministry, the whole historic, not just the part that is maybe perceived as the conflict. As well as when we look at that, we also realize that the effects of this conflict are not the simple, but they often affect more than we ever expect. The writer also speaks about how what's called family systems theory, and so it suggests that the church behaves much like a family. And so, as I mentioned earlier, there's these interpersonal connections within the church that are much more than a business framework of agreed tasks, but rather there's lives, there's literal families in your church that are connected to other families, and we within the family of God. And so there's a complexity to that that's beautiful, but it also adds a layer of how we handle conflict, knowing that. And so this is where the writer begins to speak about the need and the demand for confidentiality. And so now let's say you've assessed it, you've got a good basis of all of the history, all of the culture, the family dynamics, you see the current effects, the past effects, you have an idea of the effects moving forward. How do you begin to address these conflicts and these issues? Sometimes where we're at, we take time. Our answer is we just need to research more. But other times it's time to step in or to at least make action. One of the things that I felt is important in the writing to say, and please don't miss this, is that there's a quote that deals with conflict is often fluid, meaning it is ever changing. It is something that today it may have one weight, tomorrow it can have another. Other contributing factors from a Sunday to a Monday can change. Let's be honest, as people go home and they begin to talk, other things are said, other things are done that contribute. So now we have something that is not stagnant but fluid, and so you have to get in that stream, so to speak, of that conflict to continually reassess and reevaluate as it is moving. Also, and this is sad but a truth, is some churches have conflict habitually. In other words, continuing. They never seem to cease, or at least the same issues occur over and over and over. I heard an overseer state one time that if the last 2 or 3 pastors have had the same problem, maybe it's not the pastor that's the problem, but the church that has one. Now, that's a little personal to some, but the point is this, is that we often assess the conflict or the problem to one, but sometimes it's habitual in a church. And so this conflict may emerge again. That's why it is important to understand history and go back as far. The writer says, as you begin to take action, realize there's 2 sides of this. There is the relationship element that we spoke some about, but how we handle this, the relationships that we want to keep, the relationships we want to continue to build and to keep close. And then there's the goals and the interest of both parties, multiple parties, whomever is involved in the conflict. What are the goals and the interest? What is that's essentially created it? And so we have the relationship and the interest, and how we handle both of those is a part of this, if I can call it a dance, that we move forward. And so the reality is in relationships is that the church is based in relationships. We are a relational being to Christ, to one another, and hence the family of God. And so it's key to first focus on relationships. Sometimes our first steps is to say, listen, we may not agree, we may not settle the conflict where everyone is happy, but let's work towards restoring relationships if that is a piece of this brokenness, because that is a part of it. And to understand that, we realize most conflict, and I found this to be true, as frustrating as it may have felt in the moment, most conflict is not malice or evil. It is not the intent of the one to hurt or to be create conflict, but rather people wanting to be heard, people that have their own goals, values, possibly their own mission, their own passions, whether it's aligned with a house or that leader, but they're wanting to speak. So look to their heart. Often those that have created conflict or created division even have still had a good heart in their motive. They just executed it very poorly. And so in grace and mercy we operate, and so we try to give them some of that benefit. So as we look in relationships, value that. Then he begins to give us 6 approaches through the paradigm of conflict management styles and the 6 C's model. And as you look for this will be a piece of your question this week, and it will be the question that I want you to focus on from this chapter. But he speaks of the 6 C's being confrontation, complacency, coordination, communication, cooperation, and collaboration. It would take me a while on this recording and this lecture to try to cover all of those. However, I want you to note the intentionality that is in this, as there is obviously in all 6 of these, there is a clear evaluation that has happened of what is going on. There's a clear assessment of where this conflict is. And so at each level of importance, of each level of how big it is, there is a different response. And there's pros and cons to each of them, but it gives you essentially 6 different approaches of how you can handle it. The key is, again, intentional. Even when you determine that it's not worth creating engagement in, and you intentionally are at what it calls complacent, very opposite of confrontation. And confrontation is what it is. It is confronting, but it puts you right in the middle. Complacency pulls you completely out. Those are 2 extremes. And then it gives you the other 4 kind of in between there. But even in complacency, there must be intentionality. I remind you, it's my belief that vision must stay the key. In fact, in the house, when we're dealing with ministry, it has been my general practice that somewhere in those conversations we talk about how the vision is still center. It's our goal. If it's as simple as we want to honor Jesus and all that we say and do and build from that, nonetheless something that we all could agree on, and finding that. One of the other things we have to ask, if we are personally involved in some conflict, is to ask honestly before the Lord what our piece of this conflict is. What is the core of it, and what our contribution has been, I think is important part, especially when we're there, because in some of these matters of the 6 C's, you can become very involved in the sense of presenting your personal opinion in your side. And so we have to be clear of our own motives in this, and assure that the purpose is to bring a better unity, even if there's disagreement, but still unity in the vision of the house and what God is doing. How do we simply manage that? And how do we address it so that all sides? So those 6 C's are important. And so it writes that the biggest decision is simply to choose to intervene or not. And it's important. It gives you somewhat of these parameters to determine to intervene or not. And one is the church corporately involved, then the pastor must intervene. If it deals not with individuals, but is the church corporately, the body, maybe it's 2 leadership teams, or within a leadership team, there's how the ministry is going to approach something. Certainly, there must. It doesn't say it this way in the book, but I will add it. If someone is sowing discourse or division in the house, even if it is an individual, it is detrimental to the ministry. If someone is speaking in such a way, it must be done prayerfully with proper analysis that we've already covered, but somehow there must be an intervention to not continue to divide the house. If it's more of a personal nature in the sense of individual to individual, even within the church, then maybe not. Again, not always, but there's some version here. So this is some degrees of this. This is where the writer begins to look into what he calls the pyramid, and the pyramid approach is how wide and how narrow it is from top to bottom of the pyramid, and at what point we would focus. Where does this fit into the need for me to be involved and the importance that it has? Certainly any conflict is important, but we as pastors or leaders, wherever you're at in ministry, it's not solely our responsibility to settle every every disagreement or every complaint, certainly not even every conflict. Even Moses, if you go back to when his father-in-law Jethro came to him, caused him to say there are some conflicts that should not come to you, and that's when the principles of Jethro were placed, where different layers of leadership from delegation were in place. And so you may not be the one to need every matter, but you do make that choice to be involved or not. And that pyramid could certainly help you make that decision. And again, if you haven't read yet, you'll catch that in the reading of it. I've often said not every member will agree on the color of paint that the church should be painted, but we should have agreement on the vision and mission of the church. And so, again, this is a mindset of being prepared for different conflicts, but teaching what is important and what is not, what unity looks like and what it does not. And so, one of the things as you do engage is to, again, we talked about the mindset early, but it's worth repeating again, is what your mindset is. Are you seeing the positive? Are you seeing the strengths? And conflict, that sounds difficult to bring up, or like we're talking two different issues, but certainly as two brothers or two sisters or two ministries are discussing and dealing with some element of conflict, there is a great possibility that both are bringing about great principles, and that together we could be stronger and better than we could individually if we would just listen and give everyone a voice to bring their strength and to point out the weakness, not the failure, not how bad one is, but rather how our strengths can come together, how our positives can work in agreement, that our weaknesses would be minimized, and that together we would be better. So as the leader that is dealing with conflict, it is important that how we handle it. The quote says, people will remember how you handle it more than they will remember the issue that you were handling. And so he gives three different areas to retain credibility: personal integrity, how you handle this situation will speak of your personal integrity. Certainly, if it is biblically sound, and if you retain a Christian spirit. And so your own personal engagement as the leader, your character, retaining your personal integrity, building upon biblical sound principles and your Christian spirit. And let me say this, you can do the right things, but do it in the wrong spirit, in a way that would very much not be Christ-like. You can be confrontational and still retain a Christ-like character. This doesn't mean we go in throwing tables. That is often poorly interpreted. But the love of Christ, even in conflict, can emerge, and people would say, we disagreed, but I still felt the love of my brother or my sister. And so those things personally, for you to regain integrity, is important, with a mindset that we want to preserve relationships above the issue or the conflict, because we are brothers, we are sisters, and we are working together for the kingdom of God. As well, the writer then says there's three keys to remember, and this is, I found, so true, and it's so hard, especially if you as the leader, the pastor, the ministry leader are at the center of this, and that is, first, you are usually not the center, or it is not personal. Let me say it that way. It is not generally about you in a personal way. I know there's some exceptions to this, and maybe in time it gets this way of conflict, continues to build, it can become personal, but usually it's someone just focused on something, not you. Second, as a leader, it reminds us in the reading that we need to develop thick skin. This is a sad reality, but don't let everything get to you. Don't let every look, don't let every word that is said. Certainly in a congregation, you're going to have many opinions. All of them have valid concepts to them, certainly, but ultimately it's what the Lord has called us to. We listen to grow and to learn, but not to get offended or to get hurt. Third, he says, be slow, be intentional, and careful of what you choose to engage in. As you make decisions, as you move, you can always move to the next step, but do it slowly, do it intentionally, do it thoughtfully and carefully. Certainly we as leaders, as pastors, can be emotional. We can engage in situations quick to respond, and we can even biblically speak again to Jesus turning tables, to respond with passion. But as my mentor said one time to me, if you're going to spend 10 minutes in a conflict of conversation, spend at least 20 in prayer. I'm certain he heard that somewhere himself, but nonetheless, the idea behind it is if I'm dealing with conflict, if I'm dealing with a relational issue, I need to spend time in prayer twice as long as what the conversation may occur. Why? Because I need to respond the right way. So be slow, be intentional, be careful how you choose to engage. It could steal your time if you engage in it too quickly. You get too involved. It could cause you to lose a voice because your voice into the matter, because you speak boldly to your opinion, and now you've lost your voice in other more important matters, or even that one. So be careful, be slow. It's rarely ever a bad decision to wait and pray and seek. There's very few conflicts that will emerge that you must act instantly. Certainly there are a few, particularly abusive situations, but we're talking more interpersonal, relational issues when I say that. Before you engage in conflict, make sure first that you've resolved any personal relationship matters, meaning with you and the Lord, with your own spirit and heart. That's where your personal prayer. And we do that in part through gaining what he says is solace or peace in our spirit through our prayer, through reading. We want to make sure that we're in the right position before we engage in conflict, that we have the heart and the mind of Christ. And then it reminds us that it's good that we seek counsel from a multitude of counsel. This is not to go and gossip. This is truly people that are confidential. You don't even, I have found, I do not even have to tell them names and specifics, but here's generally what I'm about to face. Here's what I'm thinking. Here's what I'm sensing. Please help me out. Some would call that coaching even. And so how would I walk through this? I've had a few calls over the years, even now with where I'm at in ministry, and saying, hey, I'm facing this situation. I have this leader or this member doing this. What's some advice? That is a great way to get some reflection on what you're thinking. So that is a part of your own preparation to do it well. Make decisions for what is right for the good of the church, for the good of and the mission of God, but not necessarily what looks good or feels good, for what is right, not what feels right, if that makes sense. We want to do what's right before the Lord and to the purpose of the church. In so doing that, as we kind of begin to conclude this chapter, and I'm not going to spend this long on the next, so no worries, is that we must continue to speak unity. Unity is, again, greater than words that are said, but rather it is about buying into vision and the big thing, the thing that is most important. Certainly the evangelical statement of who Christ is theologically is the matter of weight, but inside the house, inside your ministry, whether you're a pastor or minister of a group of ministries, or an individual ministry, I should say, in your church, what is the thing we're purposed with, our mission, and being unified in that. Reminding those around you, unity is not about agreeing on everything, but rather agreeing on the big thing. Agreeing and focusing on the big thing makes the little things smaller. Unity is not about the absence of conflict. That's not true. That's not correct, but rather it is about the focus on something bigger. And in our conflict and in our disagreements, we can love one another and we can embrace differences, because together, as we seek God, we will grow together, iron sharpening iron. It's important to do that. There's a quote that ends this section, says that the church can have a unity centered in Christ, focused on the vision, mission, and values of the church, and still have respect for and diversity of individual opinions, beliefs, and values. That is so huge in what you're doing. Whatever leadership role you have, embedding that statement into the culture of your church will make it better and stronger, and not weaker, but rather stronger, because it prepares them to handle conflict. Now, I told you in this chapter we're going to deal with the 6 C's of managing conflict, and how you have, through this chapter, through the reading of this, what you have gained insight of. Most likely, for example, there may be some of the C's, say 1 or 2, that you have not used or you've not thought about in that way. I want you to write about how you have gained, particularly in this area of the 6 C's, about how you could address conflict and the change, and from that evaluate to implement one of the 6 C's in that. So work through that. Personally, and I'll write this in the discussion as well, this isn't for you to write, but I do ask you, because I think it's a great personal reflection and probably very personal, is I want you to think through the areas of conflict you have walked through in ministry. And I want you to evaluate how vision, or there the lack of, could affect, or did affect, I should say, the ability to better manage conflict. Now, again, this is not to attack you if you feel a weight of that. That is rather a reflection to grow, because I believe a huge part, maybe I'm overemphasizing, that a clarity of vision, communicated, bought in, and believed by the whole, reduces the intensity of conflict and the division thereof. And so, encourage you with that. Now, to quickly highlight chapter 16, when we begin to look into accountability, this chapter is vital, and I certainly, by the lack of length of lecture here, do not mean to minimize its importance. However, it is very straightforward in what it is saying. There are a variety of things I have noted and highlighted from my reading of this. But as a pastor, as a leader in the body of Christ, we are accountable in a variety of ways. We're accountable for our own leadership. We're accountable for the activity we have. We're accountable to the finances that we manage, no matter what element or where we're at in ministry. And we must be accountable to our ministry of our family, our personal well-being. And so all of those areas are areas we manage, but ultimately we are accountable. In the reading, it reminds us that to have accountability, to have that answer, someone that we're answering to for those things, we must have that someone. At our church structure, there are, in the ministry side, most often someone that you answer to that is there for accountability. But even in your home or your ministry outside of maybe the constraints of the structured ministry, having someone you're accountable to is important. If that's your spouse, if that's a friend, that you keep one another accountable for elements of particularly family. These are important. Again, I would love to address the importance of family and being accountable to one another for that. But again, please read through this. Note this chapter and the needs that you have as a leader, as a pastor. There are some issues. I will address this because I know there were some comments, I think last week, regarding the terminology of business inside the church. Certainly, we can overutilize that, but I'm not offended and least of using the language, what we would traditionally call business, to communicate in the house, because it gives us common language. It doesn't, by nature, using business terminology by nature doesn't make something non-spiritual. We can actually make something biblical and spiritual, even though it's maybe a traditional word in business. We can make it spiritual if our heart is in the right place. Certainly, using it doesn't make it that way, but framing, for example, that the pastor is president, CEO, and pastor and shepherd is not unbiblical, because the pastor has care of the management and the administration of the house. The North American language of that is that he would be CEO, and our incorporated documents for legal purposes in the state I reside, I am listed as the president and CEO. And so it's a literal term, it's a reality. And so understand that there's a responsibility that, yes, is spiritual, but is also legal. It is also in a matter of business. And so these areas are so important. And depending on where you're at in ministry, there's some terms and some specifics that may or may not be applicable, but please read through these. Our question is going to deal with the area you feel that you could be more accountable to, and how you could put some things in place to be accountable, and what that would look like. And so I want to encourage you, because you and I both need to do that. There's a lot about finances. Churches, pastors, and leaders, one of the greatest risks that the enemy would use and our culture would use is that some leader has misappropriated funds, or mismanaged, or not been a good steward, not had ethics and integrity. And so this chapter speaks in detail about some different elements of financial statements, different types of statements, revenues, expenses, the comparative financial statement, balance sheets, an annual financial report, how audits, internal or external, could happen, cash offerings and how you handle those, the policies and procedures that you put in place as the leader to ensure integrity, payroll elements, discretionary funding, benevolence funds, donor restricted. I'm giving you highlights of this chapter for your sake. How we use personal funds or shouldn't use them, and board accountability, board actions, and things of that nature. Again, I don't want to read all of those, but I do want to mention one thing that I have found that has been beneficial in our house, dealing with accountability from the ministry to the congregation, because in our day and time, not only in a matter of business, not only in a matter of integrity and transparency, but for people to be bought into the vision, they must see a sense of accountability. And so we now put together a very intense annual report. We do a night of vision, and there is probably 20 pages to that annual report. It contains not only financial statements, but it also specifies those areas of ministry that those funds were for. It brings about the life transformation that has happened from the activities that those funds conducted, to testimonies of what God has done through the years. It has changed some, but what we have done is tried to bring the accountability to connect it to the spiritual, that people see the money and the giving that they're doing to the ministry and how they correlate together, and how all of that ties together in the vision as one big purpose. And so whatever you do, bringing more information to people is not a negative, but rather bringing light to it brings about transparency. And if you can, as a leader, not only be transparent with it, but you can speak that transparency, that accountability to every area of ministry, whether you serve under them or you serve them directly, bringing about and tying it to the mission and the vision of the house will be important for them to buy into what you are doing. And so if you have more questions about those annual reports, I'll be happy to answer those, but certainly look through those details a lot, again, through the financial statements and the different financial language that is there that would be important to you. And again, your question is going to deal with areas of accountability in your ministry. What do you have in place? What measures could you add to your ministry area that would bring about more accountability for you and your ministry? It could deal with your personal, family, or again, it could deal more directly to your ministry. But what measures do you have in place? What are you putting in place? And then I want you to reference some of the reading of how it's enlightened and enhanced what you are going to do. Again, God bless you. Thank you for your time. We are nearing the end. For those of you that will be at the assembly, I look forward to seeing you. God bless you, and hope you have a great rest of the week.